Hi, everybody. I'm Lee. Welcome to Colloquia Comica. That's just comics chat in Latin. Looks better in Latin than English. Comics chat is a colloquium, but now it's plural because this is the second video. So, yeah, learn the plural. One colloquium, two colloquia. Last time we were looking at Flash. We were looking at my first ever Flash comic, and I didn't know it was one of those two. The first Wally comic, the first Barry comic. Very confusing. Who's who? But I didn't care about those details back in those days. Last time we really got into this comic, and how it would be amazing to bring Barry back now as the Crimson Comet. Come on, DC. It's a great idea. Anyway, we looked at this one last time. I thought today we could skip forward, like that was in 78, the year before I was born. And now we're skipping on to the 90s, just into the 90s. So Barry was still around in on Earth 90, the original John Wesley's ship TV show. And again, that was confusing. Like, it's the same guy, but it isn't. And to make matters worse, when Barry actually did come back in the comics, they gave Wally this like Batman nose. Uh, I don't want to get into the details of like which Flash is better, but I never liked the nose when Wally had it. But like, couldn't they have given Barry that nose? Because there's a precedent for it. That was Barry. But like they could have given Barry that three-pronged lightning bolt that looks like icing on a flash cake, and the Batman nose. But yeah, I was never a fan of the Batman nose with Wally. I think it was not just the nose, because some artists drew that nose and it looked pretty good, but never the actual Flash artist. Like you can correct me, whatever, but the artist in Jeremy Adams' run, like I don't know, like he made faces look ugly, and now he's on Green Lantern Corps, and he's not a bad artist. Some people like him because he looks realistic. Yeah, people look realistic. They look ugly in the real world. Yeah, but he always made Linda look ugly, and he didn't make Wally look ugly as such. But like, you know, the sharp nose was always like really like sculpted around his nose, so you could actually see the shape of his nostrils and stuff. And never sat well with me. Uh, but anyway, the new run of Flash, like number 31 is out now. Maybe I'll do a review of that. But yeah, they finally got him back in the classic costume. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, I was never a fan of the nose. But that's the precedent. It was a Barry precedent. But yeah, it was really confusing for some people. Wally's the Flash in the comics, Barry and the TV. But like, I was a kid, I didn't really think about that. Like, I didn't care about the details. It was just fun, right? Anyway, so I thought today we could take a bit of a deep dive into this one. So, of course, I got that cheap. This was before I was buying them as they were coming out, the latest issue, because this was in the 90s. So, like, I mean, this was like 1990. So, there's no way I had this when it came out. We'll talk about where I actually might have picked up a new book, like waiting for the latest issue later, maybe another time. But this was the story arc. So it's the Messner-Loebs, is it? Yeah, Messner-Loebs with Greg the Rocker, Greg LaRocque. I don't know how you pronounce his name because back then I had no idea. I just pronounced names how I saw them. Anyway, there's the artist, and this was a bit of a funny arc, but it's very much the Messner-Loebs kind of story that it's very much down to earth. Like Wally's a bit of an asshole, and he's a bit dumb, and he does all sorts of stuff. But he's human. He's not like he's not like Barry that knows how to do everything. But anyway, this was the arc, So he gets involved with like some cult, like like a lot of people, if they're a bit dumb, like Wally, or they lack the thinking tools, the intuition pumps of how people out there in the world are going to manipulate you. You can very easily fall into uh, one of these types of cults, and Wally is no exception. All of his time as the Flash is no psychological defense against falling for con men and tricksters, which is essentially what happens. But in some sense, it does contribute to his psychological development as the Flash, because although they are tricksters, they do in fact, in some way, really help him, because he's got this inferiority complex about Barry was always a better Flash than me. So so this it makes it is an engaging story, these stories are not like the totally whacked out time travel, alternative dimensions, crisis every week story that we've gotten used to nowadays. Like post crisis, they really wanted to bring these comics back down to earth. They wanted to make the characters relatable. And I think Wally's legacy is this, that he's the more relatable Flash, not just because, like in the cartoon, he was the cool guy, the funny guy, because he isn't funny here. He's a bit of a jerk sometimes, but he's quite serious. He's quite tormented in some respects. But he's relatable in the sense that he's deeply human, and it's like, okay, yeah, powers like this, it's not realistic, but it's like some semblance of how it could work, right? And of course, he gets manipulated to advertise this cult, like selling, I don't know, pills, pseudo medicine, all sorts of stuff. He gets sucked right into this, and this is back in the early 90s, and like we have to be even more on guard about this type of thing now, because the internet, like any of us, can get sucked into it. And if you have like some celebrity like Flash who is promoting this stuff, like the rest of us are very vulnerable to falling into this kind of thing. So it's a very interesting story. Messner-Loebs always played with like very important social issues. So crank, uh, uh, religious groups, New Age, right wing fundamentalists, but homelessness. He deals with a lot of these real issues, and that's part of Wally's development as a human being, because he starts off as a bit of a jerk, right? And he develops as a character, as a human being, and that's part of his journey as a hero, you know. But anyway, we're going to look at this one because that's the one I'm nostalgic for. I love how he has the ring outside his costume. Like he fires the costume out of his ring, takes off the ring, puts on the costume, puts the ring back on over the costume, and does the opposite when he's, I don't know, sucking it back in. But this is back when he had Barry's actual costume making machine. He himself had no idea how to do this. Um, so, it would be really difficult to actually look at the comic, the physical one, in an online context. But you should all know about the DC Universe online platform. It's fantastic. There it is, right there. And it's a great way to like read online. Obviously, we can't buy all the millions and millions of back issues. Uh, I do buy, the collected issues, collected editions. I even have like collected editions of actual comics I've got, just because the more it's just easier to read them in a huge volume, and I really get annoyed, like taking them out of the bags. Plus, the originals kind of feel like objects of desire rather than an actual thing to actually read. I used to criticize my dad because back in the 90s, he had his 60s comics and he was doing that. He was like, I can't read this. It's an object of desire. It's, something to put on a pedestal rather than read. And I was like, Dad, just read it. And now I'm doing the same. But anyway, it's great because you can, I don't know if you can do this, if I can really show you, but you get the pages, you can flip through the pages, it's fantastic. But you have great features that you can actually have it where it just zooms into the paneling. It's a bit difficult for the first bit, but like double click, you get the full page. And then when you get into the meat of the story, you just click on one of the pictures and it zooms right in. And then you just flick through it. And it's a great experience just flicking through. You know? And reading online is a bit annoying, but this is actually a very good experience. And, you know, again, like a new issue, maybe a back issue I've never read before, or the new issues. There's still something sacred about when you read it for the first time. But back issues, I can pretty much read these ones I've already read. I can just read them on the metro. Modern life, for better or worse, is like this. So it's a very great, it's a very nice way of looking at it. But we're not going to read the whole thing that way. Uh, Maybe I'll just share the screen and we can look at it properly. So it's issue 39, that's back in June of 1990. And it's this great Flash logo from the 90s with the lightning bolt. The current Absolute Flash logo is a pure homage to this. They've kind of worked the lightning bolt into the S with Wally's two-pronged lightning bolt for Absolute Flash, but it's really harking back to this, and the way that Wally is a troubled young man is very much in this kind of early Messner-Loebs Wally stuff. Anyway, stay back, Linda. I'll protect you. So Linda had been introduced a while back. She was a reporter, and it was that kind of slow burner relationship. Like this stage, they're still just friends, or not exactly friends. Doesn't actually look like Linda here, but I think she's been possessed by some demon or something. Anyway, let's look at the story. So, I've not read this for a few years, but Messner-Loebs is the writer. Greg LaRocca is obviously my favorite Flash artist, just because, yeah, nostalgic reasons. He happened to be the artist when I was first reading it, but also, he gave us that great 90s Flash look, with the chrome look and the white eyes that have become iconic for Wally. This is before that was introduced, but he's just such an iconic Flash artist, and he was on the book for so long as well, like right from number 15 right up to 79. That's a great run. So he really took Wally through this, and so this issue like really demonstrates of how naive Wally is. Like there's all these Messner-Loebs is always poking fun at different people, different sectors of society, and New Age Religious groups are no exception. So, there's always people trying to sell nonsense to you on the internet. Crystals, in the DC universe, maybe the crystals are real, right? But again, the post-crisis world, they were trying to go with a more realistic vibe. Obviously, you can't do everything. But Wally's been being manipulated. He's bought into this cult because he has daddy issues, both with Barry and also his actual dad. So this is a very interesting part of it because he thought his actual dad was dead, like was it in Millennium? His dad was revealed as being one of the Manhunters. And then in Invasion, he thought he'd redeem himself and fight for humanity. But then he's trying to make a cheap buck. So you see where early Wally kind of gets this selfishness from, that, his dad was like that. His dad was in it for the money. And in the early, like, Mike Baron stuff, Wally is very much like this. Like, why should I? Obviously, I'm going to save people, but, I have to look out for myself as well. What do I get out of this? Barry died poor. So you can kind of see he kind of gets this attitude from his dad because his at the end of Invasion, his dad is like, I've got this device that can detect if someone's a shapeshifter or not, because it was shapeshifter bad guys in Invasion, right? And Wally's like, how do you, Dad, that's not a thing. Like, where did you get this tech from? It's like, obviously it doesn't work. I'm just manipulating people. But he's trying to make a quick buck. And you see that where Wally is developing, it's like, you can't just manipulate people for money. So his dad then, uh, in order to make his son proud, is the one that has to be the guy who, sets off the bomb to stop the aliens and everything. So you think he's dead. That's like issue 21, 22 maybe. And now we're up to 39. So his dad has been presumed dead this whole time. But now his dad is in with this cult. And you see how yeah, he's manipulating his son and they're using his dad. You'll see how in a moment. But this is not out of character for Wally's dad. That he was always a bit of a con man, and he's doing the same kind of thing now. Yeah, back back in Millennium, you get the revelation that he would, or the revelation of retcon, that Wally's dad has been kind of manipulating his son all this time. You know, but he's been encouraging him as Kid Flash, but on a path to greatness. But different to how Barry does it. Barry wants him to be a good person and help people. His dad is kind of trying to get him to be this great hero, but in a different sense to how Barry's doing it. But Wally does have these two father figures, Rudy and Barry, and it's always why, isn't it? Barry, Rudy, Wally. But you can see how in Absolute Flash they're now playing with this idea that like his dad is the military guy, like he's not working for the Manhunters. Maybe he is, but you get the idea in Absolute Flash that it's a revelation to him when it's revealed that at Fort Fox there are actual aliens there, and he didn't know about it, right? But they're playing with that, like he was part of the invasion story. He's part of the Millennium story of being a manhunter. But that like uncomfortable father figure, like the Oedipus complex, right? Wally has this complicated relationship with his dad. But of course, the way that it plays out here is very interesting. Again, I just love the way Greg LaRocca draws just normal people. there's so many normal people. Half of Wally's, uh, half of his cast. It's not Team Flash, with tech bros and heroes. He hangs out with normal people in this period. It's very interesting. So at this part of the story, Wally is being brainwashed by this cult, and he's kind of found out that his friend Linda Park is there undercover, and he's like, "But these people are genuine, and you're trying to make them look like fools." And it's a nice twist in the story that, they're all fakers, but she isn't. Like, she actually does start to channel some of a like life force, spirit, ghost. So she's at a cult and they're all fakers, but it's the typical thing of those that, power should never be given to people that actually want power. So these are con men and fakers. But even if it were real, they're the kind of people that shouldn't have it because they're out to hurt people, to manipulate them for money. And power is only safe in the hands of people that don't want it. That's a good sense of who should have power in this world, whether it's political power, religious power, or whatever. So Linda is exposing these people, and then she actually does manifest some real spirits because, like, the real spirits may be pissed off that these fakers are giving real religion a bad name. So, but she's like, oh my God. So, it's not just as simple that all religion is fakers and she's there to expose them all. She actually gets dragged into this. As you know, like a real good in-depth reporter will, you know, you live this, you really get into it. And she actually gets taken over by a real spirit. So then you have this tension with this. So it seems to be like the spirit of like some ancient Irish bard, Seamus. So of course, you have this sense of uh, ancient traditions that you have it within, the, the bards of ancient Greece with Homer and everything. But quite apart from Latin and Greek, Irish is actually one of the ancient cultures that, we don't have so much literature because a lot of it was, I don't know, wiped out either by Christianity or whatever. But Irish was one of the early literary languages. And, like in Greece today, you have Homer and everything, but you don't have bards. You don't have a surviving tradition because the Greeks converted to Christianity, and there's been a disconnect with their traditions. But there are still living bards in Ireland that can recite ancient Irish poetry, part of the pagan stuff. So for some, obviously the Irish also became Christians at some stage, but it was in some kind of equilibrium with their traditions. Saint Patrick, of course, famous Englishman, not Irishman. He's the Christian that went to Ireland and converted them. But it was a kind of a soft reboot in a way that they kept their traditions. So I really like this idea of like Irish traditionalism going over to the Americas, although Linda is Korean. So, but how that plays into it, I don't know. But I like this idea of like in the English language tradition, it's Irish bards, and she gets possessed, and she doesn't know what's going on with her, and of course, Wally's at first he's like, you're trying to expose these things. And he's more bothered about his own ego at first. Like, you're going to make me look like an idiot when you expose this cult, because he's a public figure and he himself is going to look ridiculous. But yes, Wally, that's another part of your character development. Here we are. Like, she's going to, guys, she's going to do an expose. We could look like fools. But they're like, yeah, we're going to be on TV. We don't care. So they love Linda. So, like it shows what it is that people need and why people keep falling for these cults again and again and again. Because, people want to belong to something. And so I think it's very important for us to have our, you know, our culture, both our local culture and our universal culture, not in antagonism, fighting culture wars about what is or is not part of my culture and separating. But it shows how why culture and mythology are important to us all, because if we don't, we're so easy to manipulate. If you don't have that, you're going to get tricked by somebody who's giving you a pseudo version of it. And these guys have been totally brainwashed and they're just like, yeah, we want to be on TV. That's cool. But anyway, this guy turns up. Uh, Maybe more on him later, or her. Uh, Wally wants to ask the person who's running the show about these doubts. But of course, they have to keep him on board because he's their key for keeping the others in line because, he's a celebrity, he's a role model, and he doesn't realize how his position as a, a, a public celebrity, like the Flash, is, you know, is really great for them to be able to manipulate all the others. But anyway, I think this is the last part of the story. Obviously, Linda gets exposed, but this guy comes in. Uh, but I think, like, at the end, so is this the guy that Wally met in the first Flash annual? Like, Wally had this, like, deft touch in the first Flash annual, back when Mike Barron was writing it. And it was like, again, another thing that was just never explored again. Wally has this deft touch. He goes to China to try to learn how to control it, and after that, it's just never used again. But it's interesting, like that he brings this character back. So of course, Wally gets manipulated in more ways than one. Of course, he had that reputation as the womanizer back then, but womanizer or womanized, but it's that womanizing aspect of his character in those early days that make him even more susceptible on many different levels, on a psychological level, on an emotional level. He's still very naive on both levels, uh, but that's not really her husband, like their brother and sister or something. But anyway, maybe I think it's this issue where they have a séance, or maybe it's an earlier. I think it's perhaps it's one of the earlier issues, but there's the séance where they they use Wally's dad, like because Wally still thinks his dad's dead, so they're able to make him believe this is his dad's ghost in a séance. But his dad is, like we said earlier, like his dad is really annoyed because like these father issues that Wally has, but he's not actually interested in his actual dad. He wanted to talk to Barry, but Barry's actually in the Speed Force. He's not actually in the normal afterworld, however they're different. But so this isn't great for his actual dad. He's not actually interested in talking to his actual dad. But really, of course, they're retconning the idea that when he died in invasion, that was just another con. He it was another con. So, but he's a survivor. He's one of those guys that does it the hard way, looks out for numero uno, and he's a survivor. But anyway, I think at the end of the issue, like there's a performance. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So this is the Wise and the Sage. Yeah. So way back in Flash Annual One. Yeah. So is this guy? So it's like this guy in China that helped Wally to control his death touch. So it must have been really successful because you just never saw it ever again. Or they're in Tibet. So again, they're bringing this guy back at this stage because you know, it's no surprise he brings this character in. Look, what does this character represent? It's like true enlightenment. You came all the way from Tibet just to advise me as I become more enlightened. And he's like, yeah, Wally, this isn't real enlightenment. These guys are tricking you. They're manipulating you. This isn't real enlightenment. But Wally, in that kind of uh, American culture of the period, there's a lot of people really desperate for some form of enlightenment, some form of, religion. And if you don't get the real thing, you're going to fall into a fake version. But he comes from an actual tradition, an actual ancient Chinese tradition of spiritualism and whatever you want to call it, religion, spiritualism, I don't like the word spiritual because it's so vague. Like, I don't like religion, but I'm spiritual. What does that actually mean? Like trying to be precise about what spirit means, because spirit is kind of like this airy fairy physical substance that it's not as we said last time with the Speed Force, that Flash comics play with the mythology of spirituality in this sense that Barry becomes a spiritual being when he goes into the Speed Force. He's made of pure energy. So just focusing more that on that aspect of who we are as human beings, because Wally is he's very much a part of his physical self, right? In the early days, he's into hedonism. He has a lot of girlfriends. He has to eat a lot. This is a big symbolic difference. Barry never had to eat because he's pure spiritual. He's made of energy. I mean, if I were scientifically, clinically going to kind of attempt to explain what spirituality is, it's this. Like Barry is pure spiritual. He's a being made of pure energy. He has no physical self. He has no heavy physical flesh and blood body. The lightning struck him, he became the lightning. Wally isn't. Wally is the physical, so he's still physical. He is why he has to eat constantly to maintain his speed because he's not spiritual. So I see this very much as part of the path for Wally eventually in like, is it terminal velocity, becoming a spiritual being and going into the Speed Force and discovering everything about what it is. That it's a path that's spiritual, psychological, but also physical. But he's overcoming. I would classify spirituality as real spirituality, as kind of overcoming the body, overcoming the limits of the physical self. And so, this is part of his journey on towards becoming as powerful as Barry. Yeah. So the Flash comics have always explored these kind of spiritual kind of issues, but it's modernizing it. It's the American mythology version. But the comics uh, have those things, and we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking mythology is the high culture version and American comic books are the low culture version, because back in ancient Greece, like mythology was for everybody. It was for the common person knew about the myths of Odysseus and Achilles and everybody, in the same sense that the average person knows about Batman or Superman these days. I'm not sure if they'd know about Flash, but they know he's the fast guy. Yeah. So in that sense, it's our kind of modern mythology. But of course, Wally wants to get answers. He's spoken to an actual spiritual guru, and now he wants answers. And I love this. I love this shot of him. This, I think, because this is the first Flash comic I ever had, and this was the first time I ever saw this like coming out, and he just zooms off, and the way that I love the way that Greg LaRocca draws Wally, because there's so many different takes. Mike Wieringo, who replaced this artist later, really got into really got into a very different way of defining Wally's look. Obviously, he got rid of the dodgy '80s mullet, short back and sides. Uh, but everything about this is iconic. Like the current absolute Flash giving him a mullet, but like the full-on Gen Z mullet of like totally shaved off at the sides, totally long at the back, totally like I've got it at the front, not the side parting. But there's a precedent for that haircut. It's just a more extreme modern version. So we get to the the big showdown, and it's not like some big boss or anything or big bad guy. It's the more down to earth showdown that she's gonna, in front of a live audience, fake this religious experience, this summoning of spirits. But someone's going to assassinate her, but of course the Flash can catch the bullet. So it's her brother who was going to assassinate her, turn her into a martyr, or maybe convince Wally even more. Because to what extent do they know that Wally is? How much do they just depend on him to catch this bullet? They're pure manipulation. So was that part of the show that he was supposed to save her? But at this stage, the cat's out of the bag. I trusted you people. We all trusted you. And it's a lie, isn't it? Some sort of stupid con that's gone wrong. I want the truth now, Celia, and don't you even know how to tell that anymore? So, Wally's fair play. He was duped, but I think this is quite often it's the kind of sunken cost fallacy. You've invested so much in this religion or this group or whatever it happens to be, and you can't admit, because that means all the emotional, financial, different forms of commitment you've put into this group. To admit you're wrong is difficult. The deeper you go, but credit to him, he admits he was wrong. He admits he was a fool. And of course, when you can see it. Like, look, I have the power, but a switch, glowing contract lenses, all tricks. When you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you know that to some extent you were ignoring the signs. And this is the thing with like these cults. It's obvious in hindsight, but it's not obvious at first. So we are all susceptible to being conned and tricked in this way. And with the internet is why it's even more important for us to develop critical thinking tools, so that we're not duped by these. Because, like, on the internet, whether it's political or religious or anything else, the internet is so full of toxic memes that we are all susceptible to this, and we have no psychological defense. So critical thinking skills is the best we have. It's not perfect by a long term, by a long way, but it's the best we have. So I think, like, getting into a lot of reading vast amounts of content like comics when you're young will in time get you into reading more sophisticated stuff, and reading, you know, literature and philosophy. But the important thing when you're young is the habits, reading habits, just getting into the habit of reading a lot. So, my mum worried when I was young, like, you're going to ruin your mind just reading comics all the time. But it was establishing that habit of reading a lot that, later when you go to university, you don't get tired reading huge amounts of stuff, whether that's philosophy or science or other things in the humanities. And all these books are playing with stuff that's in the humanities, that's in the sciences and religions, so it's a pop culture version, but it's a step on the way. So of course she's generating this fake God, but of course Linda turns up. Of course, I have the real one, and the real one, no strings, no fake contact lenses. Obviously, she's going to short circuit it. So I can't do an Irish accent, but pause the video, do the Irish accent. So it's all tricks, yeah? But Linda's is real, and she can short circuit the cameras, and they're exposed. So Wally is still like just standing around, like, what the hell is going on? Because it's not a big, supervillain battle. It's the battle of ideas, the battle of their souls, right? But Flash is trying to calm down this spirit because, like, you might want to kill her, but Linda has to face the consequences of what you do in her body. So that's how he kind of convinces her. Yeah, you're ruining Linda's life. True enough, me bocco, in an Irish accent. And of course, the spirit leaves, and Linda is distraught. So she went into this trying to expose a cult and comes out the other side transformed. So that's, the positive aspect of whether you want to call it religion, spirituality, or just literature, just developing your mind, becoming more than what you were, the hero's journey in comics, that you're going to come out the other side a different person. And Linda has that same journey. So Wally's on his path to spirituality, although this was fake spirituality, it's helped him deal with his daddy issues, his Oedipus complex, and it's helped him on his path to actually psychologically becoming the one and true Flash. When Eobard Thawne comes along a bit later and tries to do that, this is a part of his psychological journey to be ready. But also Linda, because she came in as the reporter, as the logical person, the person who's able to expose lies, and she's come out the other side like, okay, these were fakers, but maybe it's not all fake. Maybe there's something there. And of course, this is in the DC universe. So, like, yeah, we know that spirits are real. Like the Spectre it's ghosts and spirits are a part of everyday life in that world. So in our world is a bit different, but again, it's metaphorical for stuff in our world. We all have to deal with our own humanity, and our spirituality is part of that. Spirituality in the sense of overcoming the body, becoming more than we were. We are not always like a human being, like a rock is a rock. You know, you're defined as a human by how far you develop, and that can be developing psychologically, how many languages you learn, how much science or humanities you absorb, but how much you contribute to society as an artist, as a musician, as whatever. Everyone is contributing in their own way somewhere, but it's your path. And Wally has his path, Linda has her path, and eventually they get together, but they're both on a path here. So of course later, spoiler alert, it's revealed that it isn't actually a spirit, it's the Kilgore. In like one of the later issues in the 40s, it's revealed that it was actually the Kilgore who was like an electric virus that controls machines. So I don't remember exactly how that plays into it, but somehow it's the Kilgore who was. So they actually reveal at some stage that it isn't actually a real Irish spirit. Somehow it's the Kilgore. So that's how the story is resolved, right? That Linda goes back to being a reporter, but she has this arc, and it's part of her spiritual journey. And of course, at the end, her dad, of course, escapes. Her dad, his dad, Wally's dad, escapes with all the money. True to character, like it was part of a scam all along. But to what extent was he manipulating his son? To what extent was he helping his son on a spiritual journey? To what extent is he just really angry that Wally was more interested in getting in touch with Barry in the afterlife rather than his actual dad? It's like my dad, my son didn't really care. He didn't really want to speak to me. So he disappears again. He escapes, reappears at the end of Messner-Loebs' run when Wally's mom is getting married. So they have that whole story of the teleporter, the JLE teleporter that she programs so she can go on shopping sprees in Paris and Europe. Yeah. And of course, she meets some like French secret agent, and there's that resolution, because one Messner-Loebs run is over, Mark Waid takes it back into full-on superhero territory. That all the supporting cast are speedsters and heroes, and so the supporting cast of normal people no longer feature. So Wally's parents' arcs finish there with issue 61, that his mother gets married. So, Wally doesn't have to live with his mum anymore. And his dad turns up at the wedding. So that's where Wally actually finds out his dad is actually living. It's the very last issue of the Messner-Loebs run, where he just turns up with a model at the wedding, like, oh, this is my new girlfriend. It's like, yeah, right, Dad. You just paid her. It's all image. You're just trying to upstage mom on her wedding day. But both of their stories get resolved because basically they just disappear after that. Because Mark Waid, he's doing something else. But Wally's story has moved on. He's no longer going to be this kid living with his mum, hanging out with normal guys. He's going to become the guy who's going to actually become the one true Flash, at least for a while. But anyway, this is Wally West Flash 39. You can probably find the original copy somewhere. If not, read it on the DC Universe, because you can just binge all of them. They don't have all the Barry ones, but they for sure they have all the whole Wally run. You can just binge. So I've got them all down there, but I don't open these. I if I reread them, I reread them online now. But maybe we could just have a quick look at the actual issue because it's great. Because I want to know. Yeah, yeah, yeah. How's it smell? Yeah. So I bought this. Not it was a back issue when I bought it, but not such a back issue as to be older than me. It was pretty much I was pretty much a 10-year-old kid when this came out, and I must have been about 13 when they started when I started actually discovering this stuff. That would have been a couple of years later. We'll look at those Flash comics later. But yeah, you can see how it is. I always used to think that like my dad's 60s comics were just printed on really bad paper. But it's just the humidity and the humidity. Now I am living as far away from the 90s in the now 20s as my dad in the 90s was from the 60s. So these comics now pretty much look as my dad's 60s comics looked in the 90s, like old, but they don't look great because of the humidity. Maybe that's just something we can't do anything about. But it doesn't smell as strongly as this the Barry book. But yeah, for sure it has that smell and but yeah, but again, there's something special about having the physical copy. We were looking at that online for the practicalities of a YouTube video, but it's great to have a look at the actual physical copies again. And again, let's just have a look at that panel in the original. Yeah, that looks great. So the first time I ever saw him release his costume from the ring, like what the hell is going on there? And I love this picture here. Yeah, so get the originals. So, this video is not meant to be something where you can actually just see it and read it for yourself. This is interaction. This is, talking about it, uh, engaging with the ideas in the story. There's a lot of YouTube channels I've noticed where they just basically just describe something and then say it's either good or bad. That's not what we're doing here. You know, we're engaging in a critical analysis. We're putting it into its cultural context. That means both, for want of better terms, high art and low art. The low art, I don't like the term low art, but pop culture, it has precedence in pop culture. Uh, the cultural reception, how do these ideas reflect the current Flash books? You can see precedents of absolute Flash in here with Wally's dodgy 80s mullet, with his father issues with Barry and Rudy. It plays out differently, but there's a lot of that in here. So the cultural reception is how the current books are playing with these ones. But there's also the more high art versions of the overarching mythology. And mythology is it's what's that guy's name? Forget the guy's name. But Joseph Campbell is what Joseph Campbell says is mythology is other people's religion. My religion is true, but mythology is other people's religion. But it's a joke, right? But mythology is it's the powerful stories in your culture. How do these stories remain true, not in a literally they happened in the past truth, but they contain truths of the human condition. They can contain aspects of a journey that, if we really are fully developed human beings, we go on a journey. This is Wally's journey. And yeah, we don't have powers, but that's all a metaphor. That's all symbolism. We all go on a similar journey to Wally. We all go out into the real world confused, uh, not understanding that there are people out there that are going to try to manipulate us. There's going to be people who are going to do these kind of things. We all have father issues to some extent. We all have the idea that we imposter syndrome, right? That he doesn't feel he's the real Flash. How do you overcome that imposter syndrome feeling? That is the human condition. Every generation will go through that. Wally went through it. Barry went through it. Like when Wally finally actually speaks to actual Barry, when it's in Chained Lightning, where before he died or went into the Speed Force, Barry spent time in the future with Iris, and of course he forgot to mention this to Wally, like, I'm not dead, by the way, but Wally actually meets that Barry, and he's always had this complex, like, Barry is going to be really offended that I changed the costume, the chrome costume with the white eyes and Batman eyes and everything, and it's like, the real Barry is different to the Barry of Wally's perception, because the real Barry is a nice guy. He doesn't take offense. He's absolutely fine with all this. Wally's been beating himself up about this. Like, Barry would hate me because I've changed the Flash costume. I've disrespected the legacy. And he actually finally meets Barry in the future and is like, no, no, no. And Barry just basically shares a little anecdote with Wally, saying that, well, the first time I met Jay said something to me like, so you're going to stand in front of me and tell me you're the Flash? And Barry's like, got the imposter syndrome. And then Jay says to him, thank God, finally I can relax. And and Barry's hinting to Wally with this, that Jay was fine with with Barry becoming the Flash, because now he's passing on the torch, and that's the moment where Barry does the same to Wally. So you finally have that resolution that, at what stage does Wally become the true Flash? There's when he replaces, when he's more afraid of letting Reverse Flash do it in the return of Barry Allen. He becomes pure energy, spiritual, non-corporeal, flesh and blood being in terminal velocity, goes into the Speed Force and discovers what Barry had become. He becomes what Barry had become, finally. But Barry still didn't know about it. He still hadn't communicated to Barry. And so that's the final step of that journey, where he actually gets confirmation from actual living Barry before he died that, yeah, it's fine, Wally. You can go off and be the Flash. So those are the ideas we're playing with here. You can just read it as a bit of disposable entertainment. That's fine, but it works on all levels. That there's the mythology, there's the ideas, the concepts. But why? Why do people get so obsessed with this stuff? That's how mythology manipulates us, and it's why we need to understand the mythology, because it has power over us, whether we realize it or not. And if we don't realize the power that mythology plays in our lives, we're going to get manipulated by these cults, because they are going to give us a fake version of this mythology. And it's why it's important that we have mythology in our lives, and that could be reading the classics, it could be reading the Christian stuff, it could be reading comic books. Uh, but the power that is the power of myth, as Joseph Campbell said, is why, like why is Star Wars able to span the generations? Because it has those aspects that are rediscovered by every generation of humanity, because as far as our humanity is intact, as far as it's not being ruined by, I don't know, the internet or whatever, it's true, so myth doesn't mean some fake story from the past. It has soul, it has psyche in the original Greek. Psyche just means it's who you are. It's your personality. It's who you are inside. So, so you can take this in a spiritual sense, a religious sense, or a scientific sense. Like spirit is your higher self. It's becoming what you were not. You were born as a monkey. You were born as this animal. You gained human culture. You developed. No human being remains as they were as a baby. We all develop psychologically. Our culture is very complex in that, and so these kind of things are reflecting uh, that human, all too human journey. Yeah, well, I've blabbered enough for today. So, the idea isn't just to read these things. You can do that for yourself. But let's explore the ideas together. Let's explore what they mean in terms of religion and mythology. Let's explore what these ideas mean in terms of cultural reception, meaning how does it, how do the current flash books uh, take? What do they take from these? Because yeah, it's a part of a legacy, part of a tradition. The traditions have to develop. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know. Have you read this one? Do you want to read it? If you want the full arc, yeah, read everything. But if you want just this story, the story begins with 36, 36, 37, 38. And I've chosen to focus on this one because of nostalgia. It was my first ever Flash comic. Anyway, let me know what your first Flash comic was, or just the first comic you ever read. Let me know, and we can discuss it. Take care. Is there a Flash term for saying goodbye? Does like Nora or Bart in the TV series have like some future way of saying that? I don't know. Oh, Shrap. I don't remember. But anyway, I hope the video was totally shui. Okay, so sorry for my British accent. I can't pronounce Americanisms, even current Americanisms, not even future Americanisms. Like Nora thought that Barry was like a nerd, totally cringe. So I'm even worse. Take care.